This is just a bit of a rough texture pass to give some tooth to the surface to break up that nice smooth quality, that very 3D blend shader look. And it's continuing to put a passive texture over the entire head, making sure to vary the texture scale. That's another important thing too, is you don't want the same scale of wrinkle everywhere. Make sure that you break it up so where it's smaller in some areas and larger in others. Like they're quite big here along the top of the head, where it's quite possibly like a leathery sort of skin, as opposed to other areas where it would be a tighter type of skin texture. Now we're going to start looking at the ear. I'm isolating the ear using a selection marquee. And there's no detail in the ear right now, it's just the very basic shape from the original head. And it's actually a little bit too small. Smoothing it back, I'm using a mask to isolate it, and then I'm going to use the move brush here to create the overall shape of the ear. And the first thing that I'll do is I'll create the overall shape, which is mainly controlled by what's known as the helix, the outer part of the ear. Then I'll hollow it out using the standard brush and start to suggest that inner portion of the ear, which is called the anti-helix. And then using the clay tubes and the inflate brush, I'll just start massing those shapes out. Now using the transpose rotate or transpose move, I'll pull those ears out and then rotate them. Don't want them so far out that they look silly, but I do want them to be somewhat visible from the front. I want to raise them up too. The general form of the ear is really roughed in at this point. I'm mainly just trying to get the position correct. I'm using transpose just to shift it around and trying to find a place where the ear feels right sitting on the head. I don't want it to feel stuck on. And as a bonus, it's nice if the placement kind of flows nicely into the head. You'll see when it's done, the lower border of the ear actually sort of flows down into the jawline, creating a nice sort of implied curve. So it's really about just finding the best placement on the head. Now I'm going in to tighten up the form. You know, it's obviously pretty messed up here, but the basic shape is there. The forms are there. So I'm using the clay tubes brush to rough in some shapes and inflate them a bit to add some thickness. The ear was sort of interpenetrating itself there, so I inflated it and got rid of that problem area. And now recreating that anti-helix. And then masking out the anti-helix, and isolating it with the mask and inverting the mask, and then using the clay tubes brush to sculpt up that form, that sort of Y-shaped internal ear form. When you're using the clay tubes brush, you have to be careful that it doesn't bleed through to the backside and cause a problem. The clay tubes brush, well, any brush will actually sometimes run into difficulties when you're working on something and your draw size is bigger than the thickness of the object. You run into that a lot with wings and ears, and sometimes with pieces of clothing. And if you have that problem, you can just go into the brush menu. Under auto masking, select back face masking. And what that'll do is it'll isolate the brush so the back faces of whatever you're working on won't be affected. It'll just be the front faces that are affected. And continuing to work these forms, you can see I've actually got a problem there on the back of the ear, so I'm turning on back face masking and then using my clay tubes brush to fill that hole back in. And because I've got that back face masking on, it's not going to affect the front of the ear. So that back face mask works really nicely if you find yourself working on, clothing or wing membranes, anything where it's a pretty thin object, because you're only going to run into that problem with your brush when the object thickness is smaller than your draw size. I'm going to speed up the time lapse here a bit while I continue to refine the form of the ear. Just smoothing back some of the noise, and actually coming back here into the face as well and using the standard brush to just catch a little bit more shadow. And by isolating the top border of the ear with a mask, I'm able to go in with the inflate brush and mask that area out, give it some more body, and then switch back over to the move brush and tweak the form a bit. You may notice that as I work, my brushes change instantaneously. That's because I have custom hotkeys set for my favorite brushes, and I use them exclusively while I'm sculpting. Now, I highly recommend that you set some hotkeys for your own brushes. You're going to find, after you've been using ZBrush for a very short time, you're going to have 4 or 5 of your favorite brushes. Set hotkeys for those and get used to using them as soon as possible, and you'll find that you can minimize the amount of time you spend hunting for things in the interface and thinking about ZBrush, and then maximize the amount of time that you spend thinking about your work. So we're just about wrapped up with this character. Let's go ahead and take a look at the final piece. So now here we are with the final character sculpt. In this tutorial, we've looked at how to sculpt a character bust from a generic mesh. We've looked at how to prepare that mesh and also how to create polygroups to use while sculpting to help organize our work and make it easier to work into tight areas. We've looked at roughing in form using the clay tubes brush, and we've looked at some of the new brush options in ZBrush 4, including the masking brushes as well as topological masking. We've also taken an in-depth look at GoZ and how to use GoZ to add new geometry to an existing Z tool without sacrificing any of our subdivision levels. And that's a huge step forward for ZBrush, and it's an extremely useful tool. So I encourage you to experiment with GoZ and get a feel for it, and try and incorporate it into your own workflow, because it will definitely be liberating. In previous versions of ZBrush, it was very difficult, if not impossible, to add new geometry when you needed it. Now it's very simple to do. In addition to some of the technical stuff we looked at in this tutorial, we've also kind of looked at the thought process that goes into creating a character sculpt. When you're working, when you're essentially sketching a character as you go and thinking around it, I hope that you found it useful to see how I thought about things, why I moved the cheekbones or moved the eyes out, why I would shift things around. Every time you change something in a sculpture, it's going to change everything else. And something that I personally enjoy watching is other artists' work. I like to see how they think while they work, because for me it opens up new possibilities and new ways for me to consider things as I work. So hopefully you were able to get some new technical tips as well as some new insights and different ways of approaching a character sculpture from watching this particular video. Now this is part 1 of 2 parts. In the next part we're going to take this character and we're going to texture him. We're actually going to take it to a finished color texture. So stay tuned for the next tutorial. I'm just going to give you a quick look rotating around this guy. See, he's got a nice forward jutting muzzle here. There's a nice curve. Notice that the ear here continues that curve. There's an implied line that comes up along the back of that ear. And it's just a nice sweeping forward thrust. A lot of this character and profile is all about forward thrust and aggression. Even though his profile is almost a flat line, this line here helps to kind of jut him forward and give him a nice sort of brutish quality without becoming too much of sort of a meathead. He doesn't appear to me to be dumb. He appears to be pretty regal to me. And something that I've mentioned a few times before is I did want this guy to have a certain regal quality or royal quality. I didn't want him to be just a dumb demon. Notice as well these tendons that are suggested here in the neck. They're not visible at all times. They're only visible under certain lighting conditions as we move around the model. And that's one thing that I want to mention before we go, is if you can create form that's only visible as you move the light source around, that's really good. You want to avoid having all of your form read the exact same under all lighting conditions. You want things to be subtle. You want to create some subtle shapes in there because it makes the surface interesting, especially when it's moving around or when the light is moving around. Or if it's moving around through a lit room, that light is going to play along the surface and just make it interesting to look at. So that completes the first part of this tutorial. I will see you in part 2 when we start texturing and painting this character. Thank you for watching.